Blessings and welcome forward to Reasonings right here at the Tree of Life. I'm your host, Jerome Sage Butler. Gonna take you through the vibe and the experience of the free enterprise versus the superstructure. And a lot of the people is saying, what am I saying? Really, what am I saying? The free enterprise versus the superstructure. You know, society is stratified a certain way, right? And we already know it's based upon the dominance hierarchy and how humans establish, the system of order. And, once we look into the narrative, we begin to see that there are things which underlie our experience, which were more over antiquity based in what I term the free enterprise, which is the symbiosis of the living environment and our place in it, versus a contextual, constructed, designed system of resources and distribution of services and products, and the encapsulation of values and attitudes within the context of, well, this is our lives, this is how our civilization is structured. Capitalistic, some is communistic or socialistic. So there are different ideologies that are within the compendium of the superstructure that leads to incredible mechanization and materialization of our environment. But then in anciency, we could see that there was also this great big materialization, but there was an underlying principle which psychologically is a bit lacking in the superstructure today, but was very much present in the ancient structures, and that's a sense of accountability, an idea born in spirituality, the idea of a greater governing principle being responsible for our existence, and that its laws, the rule of law, is based upon its laws, which are fundamental and self-evident. And the fundamental nature of it caused ancient civilizations, First Nations, Aboriginal civilizations, to in turn construct anything that they were building based upon the self-evident cosmic law of order out of chaos. They recognize that just like how in a vast plain or a vast environment geographically, in order for the environment to be quite sustaining for life, you would have to have the polarized, like very fertile with arid, very wet with very cold and dry. Polar opposites of the environmental entanglement would be a deep consideration in the construction of the ideations of First Nations and First Nation civilizations, right? And so, because there's a law that governs how we built things, it first started through the observation, as I said, of the elements and how the entanglement in the geographic locations were necessary for there to be a homogeneous and yet heterogeneous, homogeneous because of the heterogeneity of the divergent elements having their place, that there be an homogeneous space where there be a quintupulation of the energy, there be a congealing of the energy, a unity of the energy, and hence life would start there, or we'd say there is most fertile. Because the rivers that flow through those meadows that bring fruit-bearing seeds and water to fruit-bearing seeds, life to fruit-bearing trees, and the energy that flows in the kind of weather patterns that comes through the seasons, so that you have heat when it's necessary, cold when it's necessary, you have the essence of the seeds being, the pollen, transmuted and carried through the wind. So that quintupulation of energy, of presence, the very essence of what nature is, has to have all those elements considered, and then there's a central place within where life emerges. This is the free enterprise. It was not designed by mankind. Mankind has come to respect it, accept it through observations, now we call scientific studies. But where scientific studies are led by premise only, with, without proper experimentation, we are unbalanced because social, political, and religious and race based ideologies govern a lot of the principles of modern academic work. So there is a contextual limitation, and that is intellectual and obvious. Be that as it may, we understand that the free enterprise represents the capital, the currency of natural existence, nature based living, God based living. It has its correlative in the psychological as well as in the religious. Superstructures designed by men were an outpicturing of a observation of functionalities and the essence that man's life could not be purely up to the elements or the whims of consequence, but rather by the direct nature of intent. And so, because the superstructure decided in itself that I am, sorry, I think, therefore I am, they postulated, constructed, conceptualized, and manifested a design system that says, I think, therefore I am. But in anciency, in the cosmological way of the First Nations analysis of their outlook on life, the free enterprise, its philosophical core dichotomy is I am, therefore I think. Because the first premise is, how could I think without the apparatus of thinking? So, if thinking comes because of the apparatus of being, then being has to be before thinking ensues. So I couldn't think, therefore I am, therefore I think. But because the superstructure is based upon man's thought-based ideation that I think, therefore I am, means I think at myself superior in one context, sovereign in another context, and also I think myself to be of my own origins. So I shall decide for myself and for those who are within my progeny how it is we should be. So this thought-based ideation, I think, therefore I am, contextualize a self-based impetus that when it was entered into the dominance hierarchy, it made empires amongst men wanting to seek solely for a most deep expression of his own conceptualization of that will to be, but more will to power, which we've consequently recognized in some contexts more plausible than others, is a will to self-destruct or to destroy. So I think, therefore I am, is almost a backwards wheeling philosophy and a backward moving premise that says I can go back by going forward in my thoughts and fix the seed, the codex of my experience. When the codex of your experience, that seed, that self-egg, has already been maturing and producing the kind of social and political upheavals, because the dominance hierarchy makes each version of this civilization intention to show that I can expropriate more of the natural resources and phenomena and construct of it a subjectified artifice, a ethos of my being, of my intent, a will to power, a will to self-design eternity. That to me is one of the main reasons why within the superstructure there has been an inequality. I think the religious consciousness squarely places it on the doorstep of evil and malevolence in terms of a Luciferianic or satanic agenda coming from the fallen. But if we look at it from the historical premise of those who came away from, or as it is termed, evolved out of the premise of what is called the native inscription, or a suggestive or naive, that's what we should know, the primitive suggestion on that you are a little bit beneath, you are first. That means you are unconscious, really, and that's what it's trying to suggest, that you're unaware. And awareness, enlightenment, is evolution. So let's go back. So because I think, therefore I am, is deconstructing reality, deconstructing what is to fit a premise. You see that the design continuum is filled with this power-based ideation that society designs, which leads to these eventual inequalities, as we said, some termed malevolent and evil by the religious community. But they are based in an ideology that is untenable, unbalanced, and unnatural. And it has its origin within human existence. Hence, it has its correlative impetus towards clarity within human experience. Because the dominance hierarchy has to dominate. It has to be top dog, the lion head of the ancient, transposed to the top dog of today's age. It is so splintered because the moral code that was cosmic has been replaced by the codex of man. And so man becoming his own codex is limited by his own experience of a divine nature, or his own experience of will, the will of man, the will of God, or the will of the cosmos. And if he subjects himself to the will of the cosmos, then we see constructions of his consciousness more veers to the free enterprise. But when it is squarely based upon a ideation of I am supreme, superlatives, superior, I am the end of a spectrum that began at its least and is at its most magnificent near its end. Those linear ideations were not what we in the free enterprise, in the anciency of thinking, knew to be the truth. We knew it to be circular. So we wouldn't move from one point to a point of exploitation to a point of annihilation. We move from a point of value around to a point of depression within that value, around again to the recapitulation of that value. So it's a cyclical system. So wherein the superstructure goes from base exploitation all the way to complete annihilation, takes 100 or a couple hundreds of years in some contexts, maybe 1,000 in certain contexts, or a couple hundred years. As it goes on, and as time goes on, it gets less. So the time span they have, time and a half, it gets less. So the dichotomy thereof shows that from base exploitation to gross annihilation, versus an ancient structure that took into the context the essence of rises and fall in the entanglement of fertility and infertility, fertile and arid, dry and dense, wet and moist. We understood the feng shui, the cosmological, we understood that tradition of the alignment of all the cosmic elements into a congealed being, the original being. And the manifest original being's codex is the divine seed, that self-egg. It's the only impression. It's the only expression. So as we go forward in a modern age wrought by religious, social, and political, and religious, I said that right, and race-based, dichotomies and manipulation, we must understand that the structures that be has an ideology that governs its congealed presence. We have examined its philosophical. Look at the nations that promote the superstructure, that are at the apex of the superstructure, and see their designed constructed societies or the ideation. It is white supremacist. And it stands for the glorification of the European empire, but at the behest of all non Europeans. And the consequence of such a codex for self regeneration is a self regenerative unto annihilation. And annihilistic propensities will come in. Wars of the current age, just driven by greed, context is designed by I think, therefore I am, will propel the structure to cave in on itself. So it's not so much that it's going to fall apart per se from outside, but from within itself, it will decompose because life will vacate it from within. From exploitation to annihilation versus the cycles of rising in resources and falling. Rises of one member of the kingdom, falling and the rising of another. For when the mind isn't as brilliant and is expressively and is accepted and is venerated or remunerated for the brilliance thereof, mind expresses. But when that isn't the case, mind depresses. But mind isn't without virtue or value, because mind is then contextualized and expressed as the physicality of being. So use the physical house of life with honor and dignity, and the value that was once ascribed to mental functionality and mentation is now in the physical functionalities and self-discipline. So as the rise and fall in attractiveness, maybe a few years ago you were younger and more attractive, and your capital in the context of the social hierarchy was more. I know you are aged and might not have so much of the attractiveness or the capital, and you feel that you are lessened. But within that is a lesson, opportunity for an increase. So look at it, and perspective will bring about the understanding that your strengths were developed in a particular way of expression, but the transmutation of that strength needs to go forward into a new form of expression. And as we go forward in this new form of expression, that is the completion of the cycles of rise and fall. That once you go through your sheep, cattle to self-actualize, sovereign, independent being, especially in the context of I think, therefore I am, you see the premise of the design reality. So for those channeling, championing the free enterprise and the thought ideations of racial unity and the rise of the pride within aboriginals is contextualized within the free enterprise, is harmonized in the free enterprise, not as just a social and political cry to be heard, but it is a cosmic right, and a cosmic right that has been unwritten, that needs to be rewritten, because the actuality of it is that lies and deceptions are being told by I think, therefore I am. Because I am, therefore I think. Because I am, I was able to observe, and through my observation I was able to think myself into the harmony or the continuation, the contextualization, and the outpicturing of the harmonization of nature. So ancient civilization still outstretch modern civilization in their design technology. And this is something mathematicians understand. It is deep, but it is true. And so because the contextual design mechanisms that created the old world architecture, it's so out of the league of the present, they're wondering, how could it be possible if we are saying we're evolved? The essence is, some say there's a de-evolution. And I don't think there's a de-evolution per se. I think there's been a deviation. And this is part of, again, the nature of the heterogeneous nature of life. So cycles within cycles. So now we are coming forward into cosmic truth. And because we are coming forward into cosmic truth. These alignments are forcing those within the annihilistic agenda to look at that which is eternally present and is going nowhere. That which has been expropriated and exploited for 500 years and another 500 before that, before we capitulated and went down from the opposite spectrum. We went through our own modus of disharmonization, discordance that led to the fall of our empires. Because divide and rule, and I know many speak about this and they outpicture it. And so I always say, when you're at my channel, that's not the context. It's not a strive towards perfection, but an analysis based upon my experience and my observation. Right? To outpicture divide and rule, divide and conquer, is not appropriate in the historic context, because divide and conquer starts within your family. It starts within the structure of power, within your own nation, within your own desire for power. So when people within the free enterprise and the ancient structure began to look outside of themselves for another means, this is what my ancestors told me, and I've proven this historically, that we were one, my ancestors say, but they went on another thought expression. And that other thought expression has come to do more harm to all of us. So our ancestors thought that their thought expression would have only hurt them, but it has come to hurt us as well. So because that other wavelength of thought expression came up amongst our own, that's where divide and conquer began. We divided amongst ourselves for a new design structure, so that we could establish our new generation amongst the Aboriginal could establish a new potentate. And as such, this transverged into what the European Empire is based off. Everything that is now, that pervades, came from what was before. And so within black empires was where these ideations started. Europeans just merely came in on the invitation of us and used it to truly divide the power structure of the day, and hence the old empires fell and are now become the free enterprise. The cosmic law of how things are, the ruins according to many. Many people through anthropology, and it's the first time I know a lot of people hear this espoused. I'm not saying I'm the only person who will say this, but to be frank, I've not heard anyone say this. So I'm going to give you part of my original observation. Correlations might come, that will be good. I was always noticing, right, years ago when they would talk about anthropology and I would see anthropological evidence of people displaced through time and destruction of civilization. And how I'd recognize them was not how they were presented to me. And it was very strange because I didn't know why I was recognizing them to be Mongols or great pervaders of an age, displaced, and are now called devolved or primitive or native, a codex for naive, right? And so I said to myself, how do I explain this? Wasn't a quick jump decision to come and say, oh, this is the answer. It took me a while to get it. But here's how these people are presented. I watch these documentaries on anthropology and people are so happy to go into sub-Saharan Africa and all these places and into First Nations outposts in the ancient world, and they do anthropology, but they present it to us as that we're going to document a little bit of our history, or we're going to document a little bit of the history of our planet. And we see these people and they go, and we go and they listen to the songs and the music and they say, oh my God, you know, this is, hold on, we're going to take a pause and we're going to take a little break and then we come right back. Hold that thought. And they would say, okay, they're going out into these jungles and these, you know, environments, and they're taking these primitive people, showing them singing and dancing and, you know, making their simple little houses and, you know, talk about when the design technology of man really started upon the planet, and they're saying, oh, you know, these people are so, you know, primitive and they're from the ancient times and, you know, they haven't really evolved. And that's the underpinning language. Some directly say it because we know who are the purveyors of these documentaries, right? So here's my point. Looking at it, I always said to myself, you know, if I didn't have that information from my ancestors, it wouldn't have been an issue, because it would have said, oh, you know, so this is the origins of how people evolved, and this was a narrative that I learned from anthropology early on, and this was the European narrative, right? The superstructures narrative, right? So here's how I broke the narrative open, because when I started getting into the same so-called archaeological anthropology, right, and the same so-called linguistic and geographical anthropology, I began to recognize something. First, how do I approach it, Lord? Which way do I approach it from? Okay, I'll start from the song. Okay, so first when I listen to those songs, right, there was this burning feeling inside my soul. I said, there's something about those music that they're singing, right? So I was like, there was a happiness about the music, and I noticed that there's a synchronicity when the music is being sung without the soul harmonizes, and the outcome, like whether they're washing or whether they're cooking or whether they're building things. I said to myself, there's something about these songs, right? So then I said to myself, I need to know a little bit more about these songs. So I started without knowing what the songs are saying as yet. So I tried to search more into more traditional, cultural anthropology from the African perspective, right? So because I tried to source it even more from the African perspective, I was beginning to see now, from an African angle, that this music, it was coming from a very long time. Because it says to me that, you know, primitive, as the idea is coming, saying, well, you would actually have a certain type of sound in your music, because we know this from the Fibonacci that the and the ah, right? Those are based on one more, are bass sounds, right? So if your music is primitive, like, right, we know that we call it discordant vibes are some of the primitive sounds. So we know discordant, and people who are cult and satanic, they use these discordant sounds because they know the power of these discordant for disorder. So the first people's sounds would be more utterances of, the sound, vibrations, not a contextual, constructed pattern and synchronized structure of notation. Why is that important? Are you getting it yet? I'm showing you a development, a thought, experience, an intellect. What Europeans call evolution. Wow. So I begin to see that coming through, that the songs are designed and that they were designed over thousands of years. And so if they were designed over thousands of years, these people are not just singing them out in the bush because they're out in the bush. Then how did they get to be singing those songs? Then I started understanding what the songs were saying now, because they were little snippets. My ancestors had them singing in my spirit, and I sang them, and I was like, and when I was enthralled in spirit, I was singing these songs word for word, and I was like, whoa, so liberated. And then I would go on the internet, and I would see some kids sitting under a tree singing these songs, and I would post these things, and people think I'm just, just being like others, posting these things, not realizing that I'd had a contact where that was singing in me. I was singing that word for word, not knowing what it said, until I could then find out what it really said. And when I found out what it really said, right, it really shocked me, right? Because then when I examined the music, I began to realize that the music, as I said, was developed over thousands of years. And if the music was developed over thousands of years, it showed a structure of a social order, context of design in music, evolution of people, development of ideas and ideals. These people were beginning to come into my context of dispossession based upon conquest of the first empires. The first empires, before a European was in sight, had conflicts, contrary to a lot of what black nationalists want to think. The history is there, and I would suggest you go and examine it. These songs were not songs of people who were subjected to a life that was underdeveloped into the bush. These people were dispossessed thousands of years ago, and that thousands of years of dispossession is what has caused the people's lives to be as it is. That thousands of years of dispossession is what has caused them to be out there. They were previously dispossessed in their own empires of First Nation conflicts, and have been abstracted so far because they wanted to maintain the old ways and the old orders of the free enterprise. And as man evolved in the First Nations, their concepts begin to change, and they begin to war amongst themselves, right? And these first prisoners of war of our own construction are these people that European calls primitive, and they found it out. And they've been wagging it in our faces ever since and hiding it there in plain sight. I'll tell you one more thing about it too. So the songs sing, when you hear the songs, they're singing about glorious heritage, of how kings and queens were born, of how beings came from the sky, from the stars, and made a kingdom on earth. They're actually talking about built environments, ancient civilizations, like what is termed Atlantis, Minoan civilization, by Europeans, right? That's what these people are talking about. These are thousands upon thousands of years ago. These people are like us now, so-called black people who have no nation state to bear our name and identity. But we are singing some spiritual songs that if we knew how far back in time it went, we'd be astounded. And you have some of us who quarrel with each other because some of us are still growing along the anthropology. Some of us are still growing in the awakening and they're angry at us. No need to be angry at us. We are growing back into the harmony. So these people are called primitive, are the first victims of the warfare, the clash of wills in the First Nations as time and space came. And their building technology has been the bedrock of what civilization is built on. Those same technology these people are building houses with without nails and without any form of tools are the technology where the first civilizations were built. And we're talking 50, 40, 70, 80,000 years ago, right? And these are far more intricate than stone monuments that Europeans love to talk about because they can do things like suggest that at a certain point they were entered through the Ixos into ancient civilization again at the time when it was dividing. But, and I want you to understand this, we are the First Nations. We worked with every mineral, every material. There's a history of the earth that's being hidden. Relics that go back 50, 70, 80,000 years, which show of man building, not in stone, but in wood, right? And plants, interwoven, interlocked, right? You have a modern concept talking about earthships. Earthships are ancient, that existed thousands of years before, that we had aquariums inside our houses. We had swimming pools and gardens and atriums inside. You understand what they call biodome and biospheres? We had built this before, long before this modern age. And this is the anthropology that is not going to be spoken about. And this is what's being sung about by these people. That's what their idioms are talking about. These people are 30, 40, 50,000 years, maybe even 30,000 years sometimes, dispossessed. And right? And the empires that they were building was based upon the Fibonacci, was based upon the original sequence, right? And so, where do you think the super enterprise gets its impetus from? The superstructure gets its impetus from knowing that there is a radiant field of energy which exists to manifest their desires, because antiquity did it. But antiquity did it as a harmonious mass aligned frequency, right? And because of that mass aligned frequency, right, nature has come to a new place in reality. And because nature's come to a new place in reality, we're seeing that the superstructure is slowly has to go back into, it's contracting back into the free enterprise. And souls like me are strange to a degree, and I won't deny it, because I'm human. Yet I speak some things that people are saying, did he study at Yale? Did he study at Harvard? You get what I'm saying? And it is just the concordance of the ancient times coming back in sequence. The rise and fall of the entangled energy sequence and patterns, right? But the superstructure took it to mean that there were Rehoboth, God alone, until the eternal gods, which are the composites of I am, expressed, and they were confounded. So, as we go forward into a clear understanding of our presence amongst this new age technology of individuation that I suggest should return to a collective ideation where the heroes are not the heroes of carnal, but rather the heroes of collective. Blessings, love, virtue, and honor unto you. This has been Jerome Sage Butler Reasonings right here at the Tree of Life, yeah? I'm in my home, at the river in the backyard. It's a long time I haven't been to this spot. And to be honest, I've never really filmed from here for this channel. Back in the day with my girlfriend, I used to live right up there, and I used to film, some stuff. But since having these channels, I've never filmed here. So it's a welcome vibe to be at this part, chilling. I'll take a little shot of the river as we're going out. So, virtue, love, honesty, kindness, grow, manifest the true nature, yeah, of the free enterprise in love and in truth and in honesty. Until next time, love, blessings. You are gift. Gift, gift, gift. Now to the river.
this has been one of the great versions of Outtakes Jamaica, behind the scenes.